So this is a time set aside now to clarify questions and hopelessly confused matters. So the ball is in your court. I don't want to hear it bounce.
I'm sure you have taught about this many times in the past. Sometimes I've heard it, but I'm interested in particular in focusing on experience and why that has become part of your instruction for shamatha.
Well, in one way, I think it's fair to say that experience has always been part of the instruction of shamatha. But I know what you're pointing at, and that is that I don't know about the other teachers, but I have. Let me step back a little bit. So, for people who maybe are not completely familiar with shamatha, shamatha is the practice of placing one's awareness on some object. So, when I use the word object, it's not quite complete, but often the instruction has been you place your awareness upon something that is in front of you, usually inanimate. Could be a coin, a stick, it could be a statue of the Buddha, it could be almost anything. And then you place your awareness on that and cut the internal commentary and relax. And then when the mind moves off of that, not by your intention, but by just virtue of our almost consistent, ever-present, distracted state, as soon as we recognize that we're distracted, we come back to that object again, over and over and over. And gradually, the force of repetition leads us to, ideally, automatically come back, effortlessly, I shouldn't say automatically, effortlessly come back to the object that we're placing our awareness on. But our list of things to look at has generally not included one's experience. So, for example, like this morning, we talked about emotional states and placing your awareness upon an emotional state, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and resting our awareness on that state. Resting our awareness on an emotional state is no simple task. The state itself can vanish, unlike the statue of the Buddha or the coin or anything else. The emotional state itself comes and goes. But to develop the ability to kind of naturally and routinely place our awareness without commentary, without any of the usual things that go along with any kind of emotional state, to develop the ability to place our awareness on that and just relax and the awareness rests there is a profoundly useful ability. Especially when we're in states of turmoil, when someone close to us has left us by virtue of deep disagreements, or when someone close to us has left because they are sick or they are dying or they died. We cannot escape the experiences that follow those things. And in fact, the effort to escape is anathema to our practice anyway, since the practices that we engage in all are focused on going deeper and deeper into understanding the nature of our minds, and by extension, the nature of all of our experiences. So one of the most profound ways to have intimate understanding of our own sense of who we are or who we aren't, an intimate understanding of our mind. It's difficult to imagine what would be more useful than placing our awareness on that object, our experiences as they unfold. And as we said this morning, the object is not to end experience, of course. Short of dying, we would say, it's hard to end experience. But strictly from a Buddhist perspective, even death does not end that. It continues to flow. So that's the short one. Okay?
I have a question about what the preliminary practices in Gondro are supposed to evoke or cultivate versus shamatha and other practices. What in particular do the preliminary practices cultivate?
In particular, you're talking about Nundro. The practice of Nundro, which we often call foundation practices, right? You're familiar with them to some degree, I think. So we refer to those practices as foundation practices, which really means that in a certain way they're a prerequisite to something further, but they also are themselves a practice which is worthy of doing just in itself, without even putting much weight on what might come later. In fact, some of our illustrious teachers have said that the practice of Nundro itself can lead to complete enlightenment. So that kind of statement is worthy of at least pondering, because it's made regularly with many practices. If you just do this practice, it can lead to enlightenment. And Kala Rinpoche, back in the early 70s, was on a number of occasions saying that the entire Dharma was contained in any piece of it. Any piece of it. So it was almost like a holographic thing. Like if you had one piece of it, you had all of it. Which really didn't mean that if you could sit for 1 minute still, there wasn't anything to be gained by doing anything else. It didn't mean that. but it meant that the richness was not immediately apparent from what you had in your hand. In a certain way, you might say, like, if you had, it's often the case that we have something and we don't recognize its full value or its preciousness. So one story which kind of exemplifies this is that if we are used to bringing our awareness to our experience, more than just a passing awareness, but really being aware of our experience as it unfolds, our overall experience and life proceed in a different way. So a rather crude, but nonetheless maybe helpful story goes back into ancient India when people walked a lot on dusty roads. And poverty was intense in many areas and many times. And so the story is of one person who was very poor, and so ate only what small amounts he could get from whoever might give him something to eat. Walking on the road, he became angry at a rock that was in his way, just kind of irritated generally, and so he kicked the rock out of the way. The rock, as it turned out later, was actually a dirty but very precious jewel. And so as a result, if rather than, to say it rather humorously, taking refuge in his anger at the rock, and rather than that have brought his awareness to a higher state, he might very well have taken the time to pick that up with some curiosity and see what it was, and thereby become wealthy. So I think there's lots of examples of that sort of thing in our own culture also that follow. But in the context of our meditation practice and our practice of Buddhism in general, with all of the stages and things, the point of Nundro can be, I think, stated in many, many different ways. And so what I'd like to do is pass it to Bill, if you don't mind, Bill, saying a few things about what the point of Nundro is. Is that fair?
Life's not fair.
Life's not fair. Yes.
One of the ways that I have sometimes thought about that set of practices is to start from the point of view of the profound simplicity of the deepest instructions, and then look to see, well, why doesn't that work? Why don't I seem to be able to get traction with this? What's the obstacle? What are the obstacles? And so from that point of view, looking, one element of the Ngondro practices really is kind of separate, but it's one that should be acknowledged, the four thoughts that turn the mind. So contemplating those which you're familiar with, precious human existence, impermanence, karma, suffering of samsara, really contemplating those sets the stage for us to be able to take things seriously. It's really like taking stock and looking clearly. It's kind of instead of just being lost and stuff, to really look clearly and change our motivation based on that. Then within the practices, the 4 practices of Ngondro, refuge and bodhicitta, or the cultivation of refuge and loving kindness and compassion, is just a kind of an approximate term for bodhicitta. But the cultivation of that basic ability to shift one's focus from ordinary concerns and being caught up in all that, and shift it towards the Dharma, shift it towards appreciating the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and shifting our attention from thinking about ourselves as separate individuals to actually seeing ourselves as always connected to other beings. So there's something very fundamental in that any practice that we do, if we have not actually settled our minds in terms of refuge, the mind will just take off. The mind will co-opt the practice. All kinds of things will happen. And the cultivating a strong sense of refuge is actually something that you can look at, sort of intrinsic to all practice. And that sense of overcoming our sense of separateness and cultivating that sense of connectedness, that's something that's actually really fundamental to the context of all Mahayana practice. So these, we can say preliminary, and in a certain sense preliminary or foundational, but my favorite way to think of it now is core strength. It's like you can do all kinds of exercises as long as you have core strength, and you do certain things to cultivate that. And so generating that deep sense of refuge and bodhicitta is a fundamental core strength in all practice. We can find ourselves oriented in the right direction, but burdened by a sense of, I love Ken MacLeod's term for this, loyalty to our habitual patterns. So there's a sense of we actually need to actively let go, recognize those patterns and let them go. So purification is a big piece. And again, without looking at that, it's easy to see that if we just sit, we're captured and we become very loyal to all the things that come up, all the patterns that come up in our mind. The mandala practice, which is basically offering the universe, it's a reminder that our if-only mentality, if only this, if I only got that, if this worked out this way, if this, then I'd be happy. And from the point of view of the Dharma, then I wouldn't really have to practice. But if I got this stuff, I wouldn't have to practice. But to actually recognize that all that if-only mentality is based on a sense of dependency. I'm going to depend on everything. I'm going to depend on winning the cosmic lottery. That's what, we're really kind of betting on that. So to give up even that sense of the most perfect thing that we could have, to offer that. And it's a very insidious kind of habit that we have. Sort of, kind of being seduced constantly by potential. And in this culture and with all the resources that we have, it's very common. It's just a very strong thing. And within Guru Yoga, if we don't actually cultivate the sense of not only appreciating the qualities of the awakened ones, the qualities of our teachers, appreciating those, but also seeing that we ourselves have that potential. So in the Guru Yoga, there is that aspect of that. It's no longer external. And actually in all 4 of the practices, there's that quality. So the union with the Buddha, that sense. So that's my take on it. But each one of those actually in a certain way is a core strength. It's kind of something that you really have to have cultivated. Otherwise, just the simple, the lovely instructions that you can hear, most very inspiring. As Boka Rinpoche say, nothing to do, nothing to do. But within a microsecond, we find all kinds of interesting things that we're doing. So then there's quite a bit to do in order to unravel all that. So that's my medium length answer.
Thank you. I think that, for example, with the 4 thoughts that turn to mind, I have the tendency to totally accept them, but on a kind of conceptual level, and that they don't, that sometimes they land like deeper or in my heart, but there's a tendency to totally accept them and gloss over them with a theoretical mind, kind of. So I guess I'm just practicing with that. So thank you for your instruction.
One of the things that's most challenging in all practice is actually sticking with it in a way where the glaze does not come down over our vision, and that the tendency to glaze over, you could see in a certain way it's one of the biggest long-term obstacles that we have. Getting around to that kind of the 4 thoughts, and that's where we have to kind of increase the energy, and that certainly, when you're doing 100,000 prostrations, you can't avoid this notion that you're going to invest energy, and you also have to like get over this notion that we're almost there. In the middle, one of the delightful things of doing that kind of practice in fairly intensive way is that someplace, for me, it dawned on me at 30,000 prostrations, the odometer clicked over. That 30,000, that's way more than 10. Then I was like, I've been doing this forever. And then the simple math rolled over. It's like, and I will be doing this more than twice forever. So there's a way in which you get into the frame of mind of you really have to invest energy long term.
Thank you.
Lama Michael, you said something the other day about the time that Kalu Rinpoche spent some number of years sitting on a rather small ledge meditating. And this morning, when I was pondering that, the thing I mostly was curious about was who supported him in that endeavor, and do we know anything about those people? Because you can't just sit on a ledge for years without food appearing or...
Yeah, I know, I can't do that. I'm not sure that that proves that he can't do it, but maybe. There's, for however long, there's been a tradition in Tibet for the populace to support people who sit in caves and meditate and sit on ledges in the wind and all. And so my guess is that he was supported by the locals in the region, since he was already renowned as extraordinary meditator. So that would seem to explain it, but I don't know whether we have any precise story to explain that. But it would be totally out of character if he had just sat there and worked and starved to death, and that would be really unlikely, since so many people knew about him.
He did have to move, apparently, because people did know about him, and
Yeah.
and he was also a doctor. So that was, but he at some point he had to set that aside, because the line of people to have something taken care of is endless, but he would occasionally have to move because it had become too much of a local institution.
When you say move, Bill, do you mean he just moved from that ledge to another ledge?
Since I wasn't there, I don't know, but my sense is to change location. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's good, but it's a reminder that when I revere some part of the lineage, that person also wasn't separate from the whole rest of
No.
the universe
Yeah.
of people and beings.
Absolutely. And this always is a great thing to contemplate in terms of the teaching on unbounded interdependence. So Kala Rinpoche also had a mother and father who, as it turns out, he deeply revered. And they were also fairly renowned meditators on top of it. So no big surprise that he got into that also. Interdependence is an interesting and helpful tool to look at whenever we have some kind of an issue or a question. It's often really useful to look and see, like, what is it that led to this? Where is it going? Where is it right now? Does it apparently have a beginning, or is there no beginning that we can see? Mostly, I think when we look, we can't find a beginning to profound things, because profound things often have a history. And so where do you mark the beginning? And if it happened a very long time ago, like numerous centuries, and you can't find anybody who does that practice anymore, did that practice come to an end? Or is it just that we don't know who's practicing it, or we don't know where it went and who embodies it, or whatever? But the teachings on interdependence, which are so easy to buy into, to comprehend, like that things do not arise without causes and conditions, and they do not necessarily end in predictable ways, and in many cases we could say they actually don't end. So when we talk about life and death, also in the Tibetan tradition, we often talk about life after life, and that life after life is driven by, one life leads to another life, not in the sense that the second life is dependent upon the first life, but more that the conditions that one encounters in the next life are essentially dependent upon the life or the lives that went before, and the things that we thought and did and said result in more further outcomes continuously. And the only piece of that which is a little mind-bending, if we haven't put some real time into it, is that we're talking about life after life. If we remove that, it all seems kind of straightforward, fairly normal science. But if you go from life to life, now then you get into the whole thing of karmic proclivities and the benefits of certain kinds of ethics and all, and keeping track of those things with a certain sense of confidence that whether I benefit from it or not, somebody does. And on top of that, my connection with others is cemented in a certain way by virtue of the way that I relate to those people. So if you think in terms of not just what you get today for 10 cents, really the long-term benefit cannot be measured or reckoned. But within the context of the tradition, it's definitely a piece of the tradition that those things will play out over time. It is not so hard to hold that view.
Lama Michael? Yeah.
I see you.
I see you too. Okay. So I've been contemplating this since a question I asked last Sunday. Gradually, I'm getting a fuller understanding of anger. In the beginning, when I would hear anger being one of the kleshas, it would be, yeah, I kind of know what that is, and I know when I'm angry, and people around me know when I'm angry, but then I heard it as aggression, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And then it got deeper with like, oh, it can be aversion.
Could be what?
Aversion.
Aversion.
And then I've heard Bill say it can be, and I might have misconstrued, but I thought I was hearing it can be control or manipulation. That can be a form of, aggression. So last week when I asked a question about trying to suggest a certain environment, Bill responded as if I had given advice, and I'm going, did I express it wrong? Or, is suggesting something a form of control or manipulation, and therefore a form of aversion or anger? And I go, oh, maybe I didn't express it wrong, but I didn't understand deep enough. And so I'm just...
I want to ask you something before you continue. I just need to interrupt you here. So you quoted Bill and a few
Yeah.
things along there, and I think you need to ask the question from the perspective that's outside of that, and we can clarify that with Bill later, whether or
Okay.
not you correctly, interpreted him and all. This is my own experience, is it's rare to be correctly interpreted. So I'm just trying to say,
Yes. Yeah, I always assume there's translation errors between whatever is inside me and how it comes out, and then how you hear it.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a few
So
places.
Can you ask?
So the
can you ask
question-
the question again, just from
Yeah.
your own side? Exactly.
So that's where I was coming from. That's what I was contemplating. But the question is, because I'm always, okay, there's obvious kleshas, but then there's the more subtle forms. And so I'm looking at, can you talk about the more subtle forms of anger?
What's the difference? What's the difference?
Between full-blown anger and subtle anger?
Yeah, are we talking about, like, you have a hose for the garden and sometimes you turn the water pressure up and sometimes you don't, but it's the same water coming out.
What I'm pondering is not recognizing that little trickle is water.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Phew. Yes, that's so I remember on a couple of occasions at least, back in the early 70s, I'm going to shorten the story, it's too long. So, but in essence, what would happen is that people are trying to, they recognize to some degree the cause of their own suffering, disappointments, and also their joys and all. They recognize the causal conditions of those states of mind. To some degree, their understanding is accurate, and to some degree, they're just missing the boat. And so I reach often because my primary personal and emotional state is curiosity more than anything else. So I recall Kala Rinpoche saying that if you develop to a certain point, then you actually genuinely take, especially the difficult situations that we find ourselves in and the very difficult experiences that we have and haven't even really looked at them yet. All those things, he said, like when you develop to a certain extent, you accept all of those things as a gift from the Guru. And I remember finding that a shocking proclamation. Like, first of all, my little mind said, why would someone you trust give you such an awful thing? And of course, the truth is that he didn't give it to you. That's yours. But in order to actually use that energy, which is kind of like pouring gasoline on yourself and igniting it, and then you're sitting there thinking, I wonder how you put this out. So, well, gasoline's kind of cold, so you pour some more on. It just is remarkable how we can weave ourselves into very difficult situations and continue to hold others responsible for it, for example. So, in this case, the miraculous, skillful means of his statement take every one of these things as a gift from the Guru, miraculous in the sense that if you can hold that view, what you find is that it actually is precious. But primarily it's precious because you've been given the tools with which to work with it. If that hasn't happened, then it's kind of cruel. But the interesting thing is, we get the tools and we work with them, and then we get slammed with something and we want to take it as the gift, but we can't, because it's almost like we refuse to use the tools. We have the tools. They're right in front of us. We know how to use them, but we're more attached in a certain kind of macabre way. We take refuge in those emotional experiences, which we in the moment recognize as harmful to us, and by extension, because they come into us, then it affects all of our relationships. This is just simple. You don't have to be a shrink to know that. That's pretty much how it gets started. So that statement from him, which I was just immensely curious about, and over time I thought that was maybe one of the most valuable teachings I ever heard, and it was less than 10 words, and really short. But it seemed like, one, it had to be somebody who you trusted. That teacher who you're going to think, this is a gift from that person. You have to be in a position of trusting that person, having a sense of what we, call devotion to that person. So they really, that person would not harm you. You also have to have a sense that that they have enough wisdom to know the difference between harming you and not harming you, and a number of other obvious pieces there when you think about them. But if you can hold that view, that whatever experience I'm feeling, it doesn't have to be some nasty thing that happened. It also doesn't have to not be something really good. But if we can think of fundamentally all of our experiences coming from a profoundly good teacher, that cements our connection to that person in a way that negative experiences can become something that helps us to thrive, not undermine our goodwill or our discipline or our compassion and loving kindness for others, but rather we feel like we've received so much of that compassion and loving kindness that it's overflowing. It's kind of mysterious in a certain way, but in another way, it seems just obvious. You know that, don't you?
Lama Michael, I first remember hearing that instruction from you about seeing it all as a gift from your guru.
Yeah.
April 5th last year. and it doesn't always come to mind, but it often does. And I get to I don't have a word for that.
A word for?
The experience when that is recalled in my inside.
It's the experience that's recalled.
Yeah. And thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good enough? Yeah. Well, how are we doing? Any more?
I feel like I've probably ventured, like, put something forward like this before, maybe early on when I first started coming here. I'd like to hear a little bit about working with distraction that arises from like sensory experiences or in general distractions that arise from what's the word I'm looking for, like from experiences that don't involve the narrative. You talked early today about dropping the narrative and sitting with experience, sitting with what's happening in the moment. And I'm curious to hear about working with distractions that arise from places other than that narrative. Because I've been finding that I'm actually able to drop the narrative for decent amounts of time, and at the very least, not carry it so close to where I'm. That's like it's even if it is there, I'm not necessarily putting my primary attention on it, my primary focus. And I'm just kind of curious, how to work with other distractions, or just like talking about. I'd like to hear a bit more about working with things that are a bit more visceral, things like being tired or anxious, or working with things that seem to go deeper than just like the words in our heads. I'm not really looking for any kind of like specific answer to anything. I've just been finding that I have more room to work with those distractions because they're always there. I just haven't really had a whole lot of opportunities to notice them at this level.
So let me ask you a clarifying point, okay? Is the issue when whatever you're talking about arises as something that you're having trouble working with for whatever reason, or it's confusing? Is it confusing because the narrative that you're in is incomplete, or is it something else?
It feels like the narrative isn't the primary obstacle, or so we talk about in mind training about confront the greatest obstacle first.
Yeah.
I'm finding that the narrative, at least at this point in my practice, isn't the primary obstacle.
Okay.
It's sort of this general feeling of sort of sluggishness of this sort of general lack of motivation, despite despite having tools like the four thoughts that turn the mind and the four immeasurables and these really effective ways of generating bodhicitta, sort of a motivation to continue to work for others.
Yeah.
But a lot of times I'm just sitting on my couch with the TV on, or thinking about, just kind of like sitting with what I'm feeling and not really doing anything with it or doing anything about it. Just kind of like hanging out with it and not really seeing a distinction between me and the whatever I'm feeling in the moment. And usually it's this general kind of like murky, vegetative kind of feel.
Yeah.
and I would love to practice in those moments, because I clearly have those moments available for practice, but I don't use them.
Remarkable. Yeah.
Because I'd love to start a daily practice again, and I haven't had a daily sitting practice since like 2016,
Yeah.
and I have the time for it. I just find that this kind of like, I don't know, it's hard to describe other than saying a lack of motivation, but it doesn't feel like a lack of anything. It feels like this like active, like suppressing kind of like not paralyzing, but weightiness, or almost like I'm kind of like all of a sudden I'm like, trying to like walk through, sludge or something. Been trying that.
What'd you say?
Been trying that, actually. Caffeine doesn't really do a whole lot for me other than like make me like jittery.
Well, almost anything will work at almost any time.
Okay.
Which is, so I think this is, I think we all know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
For starters. You are not the only one.
Okay.
So, and you're on the right track when you say, I would like to work with that. I would like to see that better. It's like to do something with it. I'd like to transform it somehow, my relationship to it in some way, in such way that I would be able to like harness that somehow and see it clearly and all. And some of those things are clearly, you're in the right place. You're looking for that instead of just deciding, oh, I guess the majority of people who I know will say, oh, I'm just feeling too dull, I'm going to go to sleep. So it's actually extraordinary to say, I'm feeling dull, and I need to find out what that dull is. And of course, the interesting thing is, the answer you already know. So the answer actually is not going to be satisfying.
Of course. Is it ever?
Well, yeah, maybe when we're asleep, it might be. But this occurs, so I'm just going to say, from my own perspective, which is definitely not special, because we all have this exact thing. The issue is, what do we do with it? We had it before we were born, and we'll have it after we're dead. But that's just to say, that's just what happens. You're in this world, and you're in a human body, and you drink alcohol, or you do too much of this or that, and you feel dull, but those are not the situations that you're talking about. You're talking about a situation where it is actually not immediately explainable, and your awareness is at least somewhat clear, and you're grappling with a thing which, using your own metaphors, it feels like your clarity is bound by weights that are hanging from it. Like you just cannot move.
Yeah. I have enough wherewithal to like sort of like be like, wow, I don't feel like doing anything right now.
Yeah.
Like physically there is no like there's no physical drive. No there's no like,
Yeah.
Usually I experience anxiety a lot.
Perfect.
I experience anxiety a lot,
Yeah.
and that's generally my motivator through life is like, man, I feel anxious and I'd like to not. So let's find a way to take care of that. And now with practice, I'm not like, the anxiety is dying down, and so now there's this amazing, this incredibly like strong like sense of like plantedness, like you're saying, like there's weights everywhere. It's just like and there's just
okay. Continue.
there's just I don't really have anything to tap into because the anxiety, I'm not really, the stores of that are down. And so I'm looking for a new source of energy.
You know, it's like if you put on hip-high boots and wade into water, it's not so bad. You can walk across the field. And if there's no water, you can walk across even easier. But if you walk into thick mud, you have a different situation. And so you have to do something that's different in that situation, or you won't get to the other side of the field, or you may never get out at all.
Right.
Yeah. But the physical thing, I think it's just an analogy. So, but it has certain parallels, right? It's like you actually, in this case, would be happy to put boots on and wade into it, but you don't know what you would put on in order to wade into it, or even whether or not that thing would be helpful to wade into it. But I will say that there are some things that I think you can do that you would find the resolution to this on your own, because it is not conceptual. It is utterly not conceptual. We are way too smart to not see the conceptual way out of that. But pretty much the entire Dharma is ultimately about the non-conceptual. So the conceptual frameworks and things that we work with are really helpful and key. But in the end, it's this experience thing that's coming about. And one thing to avoid is do not put the sluggish mind in a special category. Just to put it in the context of how our own sense of self tends to deal with these things, you put it in a special category, and the next thing you know, you won't say it maybe, but you're thinking it. This is who I am. I am this sluggish, dull person. That's who I am. And you won't really believe it, but you've planted that seed. That's not good, because it's not who you are. And we know, now to move into the conceptual for a moment, we know that actually we are no thing. No such thing. Not to say we're nothing, but we are no thing, for sure. But that doesn't mean, we also know, that my no thing experience today will repeat itself tomorrow. It's almost guaranteed that it won't. And so your curiosity, which is leading you to look into it, tomorrow you won't find it. It's like
Good.
It's like one of these little, it's like a cat that slithers off into the darkness, you know, and comes out at night, and you hear it eating, but you can never actually find it. And so I think you have to play with the clever side of it. Not because you're going to find the truth from that, but because you have to stir something up. Not just in order to stir things up, like our president. Oh, excuse me.
Getting political now.
But because stirring it up, it's kind of like you stir up a non-homogeneous thing, you see different things coming up all around it. So if you take this in a kind of, almost with a sense of bravado, that I cannot make myself feel alive and awakened and all, but I know what I need to do in order to break through things. And one of them is to recognize where you are. I would say it's the single most important thing. You got to recognize where you are. So when you get into that place, you stop and you remind yourself, this is no thing. This is actually not an impediment inherently. Kind of like if I leave my shoes outside and can't walk home, It's not an inherent impediment, it's just a condition that's occurring now. So that way you don't remind yourself that you're really screwed up, because you're actually not. So you don't want to go there. So I think if you remind yourself to just look into it and stop and do the meditation. You weren't here this morning, were you? So this is what we talked about all morning, was the thing of placing your awareness on the current experience. So your current experience, it feels debilitating, but if you put your awareness on it without any agenda, the obvious agenda being, I'm going to overcome this, you have no hope. It is so bigger than you are. But it's only bigger than you are because you believe that it's something. So you need to step back from it and work into it. And almost it's kind of like bring it on. Come on. You and me, we're going to work this out. kind of like that. When actually what it is that you don't know what it is, and it's not something. But when you put your awareness on it, you are doing something that nobody does. When we feel like we are being suppressed in some way, from the inside or the outside, it doesn't really matter. In the case of what you're talking about, likely you're just surrendering. Because the immediate tool to crawl out of the swamp isn't apparent. The first thing you got to find out is that it's not there. And you do that by putting your awareness on it, which may be hard. But you put your awareness on it. It's the object of your shamatha, you could say, and you just let it rest there. And when it slides off, just put it back on.
It actually does tend to be the object of my shamatha.
You what?
It actually does tend to be the object of my shamatha.
It does tend to be? Well, then what are we complaining about?
All right, fine.
Okay. And you're going to report back, and we're going to dedicate the merit of this evening now. By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.